Although we've seriously got used to Excel refreshing anything it does by itself, unfortunately with pivot tables this is not the case. Now the reason it's not the case is because the data might not be located just 1 inch to the left in another sheet as we have here in the sales data 2018. It might be located halfway across the world. So refreshing every time it does something is not really ideal, not really a situation you want to live with. So what happens with pivot tables is they only refresh when you tell them to. Now you can trigger them to refresh in a few different ways, but they don't do it automatically. If I went into my sales data here, and let's say, for example, let's go to the top and change a Thailand value here to 200 quantity, 1,600 in the sales. I've gone dramatic so that we can see that it happens. Come back to pivot 2 and look at Thailand, it hasn't changed. So I need to actually refresh the pivot table. Now there are a couple of ways of doing that. We could do that off the right click and you'll see there's a refresh option here. Or we can go to the pivot tables ribbon, analyze and refresh all, and that refreshes your pivot tables. And then Thailand, you can see there, has now responded, 1,604. Pivot table 1, Thailand has got 1,604 and it's updated the other values as well. So we now have 2 sales, the highest sale and the average is quite high. We actually have to tell the pivot tables to refresh themselves. Now we can tell the pivot table to do a little bit of automatic refresh in that we can tell it to refresh every time it opens the file. And we do that by going to options up here on the analyze pivot tables ribbon and then options, data. And here we have refresh data when opening the file. So a little tick in there will ensure that every time you open the file, it's using the latest data. So again, you need to balance that up with, okay, I'm connecting to a server on the other side of the world. Do I really want to be updating that every time I open the file? Or do I want to trigger it manually? If you're happy for it to refresh its data when it opens the file, okay. Change refresh on open option. Also change the option for the other pivot table reports based on the same data. So effectively, both pivot tables within this workbook will refresh themselves every time the workbook is opened. Fantastic, okay. Be careful about adding that option in based on where your data is located, but it's a good way of making sure that when you open the file, at least you're looking at the latest pivot table. Other than that, you need to make sure that whatever changes are made in the data, you actually refresh your pivot table, which involves right-clicking or going up to the refresh icon on the pivot tables ribbon. Now we could add a keyboard shortcut to do that refreshing for us, which might make life a little quicker for us. In order to do that, we need to create a macro and then assign a keyboard shortcut to that macro. So we come down to record new macro. I need to make sure the macro's got a sensible name, so I'm going to call it pivot refresh. Save it in the personal macro workbook so that it's then available to me whenever I'm using Excel on this machine. Assign a sensible keyboard shortcut that's not already in use. That's usually the trickiest part of the decision. I'm going to go for Shift Q. So controls are given, you have to have control in your keyboard shortcut, but then I've added Shift and Q. And then in here, a little description, refreshes all pivot tables. Got to add in current workbook. Okay, macro then starts recording. I'm not actually going to record doing anything, we're going to edit the macro ourselves. So I'm going to go down and stop. So I've created that macro that actually does nothing. I then need to edit the macro. Because I've stored it in the personal macro workbook, I need firstly to unhide the personal macro workbook. I go to View, Unhide, Personal. Then I can go to Developer Macros, and there's my macro, Pivot Refresh. I go into Edit. I can see the keyboard shortcut I've assigned, Control, Shift and Q, my description and my name, but it doesn't actually do anything yet. Come down here to the next blank line, and it's a single line command. Active workbook dot, and you can see then I've given a list of commands, and if we slowly type in refresh, it comes up with refresh all. That's the one I'm after, and return. And all return does is just add in the correct camel case for your items. So active workbook gets capital A, capital W, refresh all, capital R, capital A. I can then close the developer VBA window, then hide my personal macro workbook by going to View, Hide. And then back here, let's see if this works. Let's go choose another country. Well, actually, let's make that Thailand order quite big as well. 890, 100 items. Have a look at my pivot table. It hasn't responded. But if I then run my keyboard shortcut, Control, Shift and Q, you'll see that Thailand values then refresh. both in pivot table 2 and in pivot table 1, because the average has now shot up and the total has shot up. As long as you are aware that pivot tables do not automatically refresh themselves, you can then refresh them when you need to, or you can trigger them to refresh every time the workbook opens, or we can do as we've done here, created a little macro that does the refreshing and assigned it a keyboard shortcut so that we can then trigger the refresh very quickly, other than right-clicking or finding the right menu and choosing the right option.